Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating analysis from Wolf Street, focusing on a massive fiscal milestone the US just crossed. We're going to look at the sheer scale of it, and maybe more importantly, the behind-the-scenes maneuvers being used to manage it. Let's get right into it.
$40 trillion. In August 2026, the United States national debt crossed this absolute behemoth of a threshold. Now, to put that number into perspective, because human brains just aren't built to easily comprehend a trillion, let alone 40 of them, if you spent $1 million every single day since the year zero, you wouldn't even be close to 40 trillion. It's a massive, almost absurd figure. But for the global bond market, it is a very real, incredibly heavy number that literally dictates the cost of money worldwide. Crossing this much-anticipated line really sent ripples through the financial world, forcing everyone to look closely at how the government is actually keeping the lights on.
But honestly, what's truly staggering here isn't just that massive total sum, it's the sheer velocity of the accumulation. According to Wolf Richter's analysis, this debt ballooned by $1 trillion in just the last 3 months alone. Zoom out slightly, and we're looking at a jaw-dropping $3 trillion increase over 12 months. The government is hosting these huge treasury auctions week after week. For instance, selling $742 billion in securities in just a single week. So the core question we have to ask, the exact question the bond market is constantly grappling with, is how on earth a government actually handles a $1 trillion supply increase in a single quarter.
Well, the Wolf Street article identifies a specific confluence of catalysts speeding up this debt engine. This wasn't some slow, steady creep, It was accelerated by several distinct factors outlined in the source. We're talking about recent tax cuts, continuous high levels of government spending, the financial toll of the war in Iran, and the sudden impact of Supreme Court-triggered tariff refunds. All of these factors essentially combined to create a massive wave of obligations that required immediate funding. So who exactly is footing the bill for all this?
And this brilliantly illustrates where all that debt actually sits. Of that 40 trillion, it's effectively divided into two buckets. The smaller piece, about 7.7 trillion, sits in internal government accounts. Think things like federal government pension funds and Social Security trust funds. Now, that is true debt owed to beneficiaries, for sure, but it isn't subject to the second-by-second price changes of the open market. But look at that other massive $32.3 trillion piece. That is debt held by the public, meaning it's publicly traded and held by investors, hedge funds, banks, and foreign central banks. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this massive chunk of debt requires active, willing buyers.
Which brings us right back to that $1 trillion 3-month surge we talked about earlier. When the public debt balloons by $1 trillion in a quarter, it means investors globally literally had to absorb $1 trillion in brand new treasuries over those 90 days. And remember, they have to do this on top of refinancing all the existing maturing debt that is constantly rolling over. So how exactly do you convince global bond buyers to step off the fence and swallow that kind of unprecedented supply?
Well, the biggest lever the Treasury has to pull is yield. To entice enough investors off the sidelines, especially when those investors are carrying some pretty deep fears about inflation and relentless government spending, the Treasury simply has to offer a significantly higher premium. It's really just a mechanical reality. A massive supply glut requires juicier yields to clear the market.
And as you'd expect, yield certainly did its job during this period. Last week, the 30-year Treasury bond sold at auction at an already high 5.22%. By Monday, it had peaked at 5.31%. As the author points out, these are the highest auction yields we've seen since all the way back in 2001. The buyers ultimately showed up and absorbed the debt, but they extracted a steep price for their participation. And remember why this matters to all of us. The 30-year Treasury yield is the bedrock for 30-year mortgage rates and corporate borrowing. When these yields surge, the cost of living and doing business surges right along with them, which naturally created an immediate agonizing dilemma for the U.S. Treasury.
The reaction from Washington was incredibly swift. The article describes Treasury Secretary Bessent as essentially blowing a fuse over these spiking long-term yields. On the exact day the debt hit $40 trillion, with the bond market looking incredibly strained, the Treasury made what felt like an emergency-style announcement. They declared they were going to double their Treasury buyback program. Now, this is a maneuver initially started by Janet Yellen back in April 2024 when she was responding to the 10-year yield briefly piercing 5% back in October of 2023.
So the crucial point is how they actually pull this off. The author bluntly and critically refers to these buybacks as a hocus-pocus debt swap. Here's the mechanics of why he calls it that.
The Treasury Department cannot simply print money like the Federal Reserve does, right? So to buy back older long-term securities, they must sell new securities to fund that purchase. What they're actually doing is buying back older debt and funding it by issuing brand new short-term T-bills. They're basically just swapping the maturity profile to soothe the bond market and artificially push down those glaring long-term yields that were making all the scary headlines.
Wolf Richter offers a fantastic analogy in his piece that really humanizes the immense pressure the Treasury Secretary is under right now. He writes, quote, "Think of him as a used car salesman who absolutely has got to hit his quota and who has got to get high prices, but the cars in inventory aren't good enough, and he's desperate and has got to do something." It's a great visual. Bessent's ultimate mandate is to sell these government bonds come hell or high water at the absolute lowest possible yield. When the market rejects the price, he's forced to start getting creative with the inventory to make the sale.
So you're probably wondering, did the maneuver actually work? Well, immediately after the announcement of doubling the buybacks, the 30-year Treasury yield fell by exactly 9 basis points, closing at 5.19%. It provided a momentary psychological soothe to the market on a very spooky milestone day. But, as the article's data shows, it's essentially just a tiny squiggle in an otherwise massive macroeconomic trend.
Now, what's really interesting about this mathematical reality is how severely lopsided it is. On one side, you have these buybacks. The actual increase doesn't even begin until September, and the dollar amounts involved are incredibly small in the grand scheme of things. On the other side, you have the cold, hard math, $1 trillion in new debt, needing buyers every 3 to 5 months, forever. The author notes that a previous joint intervention in August only pushed yields down 11 basis points before they zigzagged right back up. So the scale of the Treasury's intervention is, frankly, a drop in the ocean compared to the $40 trillion mountain of outstanding securities.
Because of that, the author's conclusion for the road ahead is quite stark. Moving forward, yields simply must remain high. They have to stay elevated to pull investors off the fence and convince them to absorb that fresh $1 trillion every few months. Financial engineering and debt swaps, they can't change the sheer physical quantity of debt coming at the market. They can't magically erase the persisting fears of inflation or ongoing government spending habits. The fundamental supply and demand dynamics of the bond market remain entirely unchanged by these localized Treasury interventions.
Which leaves us with a really critical thought to ponder, and one that was heavily debated by the commenters in the source material. As we watch the U.S. government leverage these short-term swaps to mask long-term borrowing costs, we have to ask, can financial engineering truly fix a mathematical reality, or is a reckoning with higher yields and inflation inevitable? It's a massive question, and it's one that the global bond market will be answering for us in the months to come. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on those yields.